Daenerys stood on the balcony of the Great Pyramid of Meereen, the warm breeze of the bay stirring her hair, while the sound of the city drifted up from below. Once, she had gazed across the narrow sea, imagining the 7 kingdoms that her ancestors had ruled. She had dreamed of sailing westward, reclaiming the Iron Throne, and restoring House Targaryen to the heights of its former glory. But now she looked out not toward Westeros, but across the patchwork of adobe rooftops, open markets, and winding streets that formed Meereen. Instead of picturing King's Landing or Dragonstone, she surveyed the shimmering waters of Slaver's Bay, freshly renamed the Bay of Dragons, where her fleet bobbed at anchor. The shrieks of dragons overhead comforted her like a lullaby. Drogon, Regal, and Viserion soared through the sky, their scaled wings outstretched as they glided in wide arcs. She could see Drogon's black body streak across the sun, a shadow that commanded reverence. Every so often, one of them dove toward the waters to pluck a leaping fish from the bay's surface. Once, all her thoughts had circled around using these dragons to claim a throne. Now, for reasons that had come to her gradually, through heartbreak, through bloodshed, through reflection, she was considering the possibility that she had a different destiny. Meereen still bore the scars of occupation and revolt. Though her banners flew on every corner and the people had largely come to accept her as a liberator, she was well aware that she balanced upon a precarious foundation. The sons of the Harpy had been quelled, but only just. Freedmen and former masters struggled to exist in the same city without erupting into violence. Trade had begun to trickle in once more, caravans from the east and merchant ships from Karth and beyond, but resentment and old hatreds festered beneath the surface. Dany knew that she had made a promise, to break the wheel of oppression, to free slaves and punish those who would see them in chains again, and that promise bound her as tightly as any vow. Sailing to Westeros, she realized, would mean leaving these people to fend for themselves. She could leave an appointed ruler, but she remembered what had happened the last time she had tried that. She had returned to a city at war with itself, teetering on the edge of collapse. She did not realize precisely when the idea first took root in her mind, but it was sometime during the final negotiations with Yunkai and the other city-states who had sought to restore slavery. She had met their envoys in the throne room of the Great Pyramid, and she had glimpsed the cunning in their eyes. They were already measuring how far they could push her, how many concessions they could force from her in exchange for a tentative peace. The world she faced here in Essos was a world desperate for change, but unable to shed its old skin without a cataclysm. If she simply departed for Westeros, it would revert. People would be re-enslaved, the same brutality would take root in Meereen's streets, and the fruits of her conquests would rot. She was Targaryen by blood and name, yes, but she was also the breaker of chains. In Essos, there was an entire continent crying out for liberation, a place where she was loved and hated in equal measure, but also where her words and deeds had already sparked something monumental. Could she simply abandon that in pursuit of a throne across the sea, one that, to many, was barely more than an old rumor of a lost dynasty? Standing on that balcony, Daenerys resolved to do the unthinkable, to relinquish her claim to the Iron Throne and remain in Essos, forging a new empire built not on old feudal bonds, but on the principle of freedom. She knew it would require a will of steel, but she also sensed that this might be the path that was always meant for her. Over time, the notion crystallized. In a quiet meeting with her closest advisors, Tyrion, Missandei, Grey Worm, and Ser Jorah, she laid out her thoughts. Tyrion's eyes, so often shrewd and knowing, flashed with shock. Ser Jorah, though supportive, seemed saddened at first, for he had long imagined journeying to Westeros by her side. Missandei, ever her devoted confidant, listened with radiant admiration, as if she had expected Daenerys to consider such a choice. Grey Worm remained stoic, ready to follow her in any direction she chose. Their discussions lasted hours. They debated, they speculated on the ramifications. In the end, despite mixed emotions, they bowed to her decision. The news trickled out from the pyramid at first through whispered rumors. It astonished the freedmen, who had long expected that the queen would sail away to conquer Westeros. Even more perplexed were the aristocrats from the outlying cities who thought her entire plan hinged upon returning home to her ancestral kingdom. In truth, a tiny contingent of the population expected her to depart and longed for that day. They assumed that once she left, they could reassert their old influence. But Daenerys was not going anywhere. The reaction across Essos was tumultuous. Some scorned her as a fool, a Targaryen overshadowed by her ancestors, lacking ambition. Others saw a chance to dethrone her or outmaneuver her. But to many, particularly the slaves in the east, this was a clarion call, a sign that the Misa was truly committed to them. Over the next days, droves of people poured into Meereen hoping to catch a glimpse of her or to find a place in her new vision of the world. In the privacy of her bedchamber, Daenerys grappled with the weight of her decision. Her illusions of her birthright had been shattered once she realized that Westeros was not necessarily clamoring for a Targaryen restoration. Ruling Meereen, she had learned lessons that might have taken a lifetime in King's Landing. Through blood and heartbreak, she had come to understand the realities of governance. She would not pretend to enjoy every aspect of rule. She was a dragon, and her heart longed for the thrill of flight, the romance of conquest. Yet she was also a mother of sorts to countless freed souls who had placed their trust in her. If she were to lead them, she must become more than just a conqueror. That determination steadied her like the handle of a sword. She would not cast aside the most important mission, to break chains wherever they rattled. Tyrion was the first to voice real excitement at the idea. Over a cup of wine one evening, the dwarf explained his reasoning. "Here, your grace, you have something Westeros cannot offer. You have the love of a people you freed yourself. You have cities you conquered by your own hand, not by inheritance. Should we remain here, we have the chance to reshape a land nearly as vast as the entire continent to the west, and shape it in a better mold. This place may yet become the cradle of a new age. And it will be because of you." He paused, swirling his wine. "I'd be lying if I said I had no qualms about letting the Seven Kingdoms slip away. But I've also learned that doing the unexpected can be a powerful move. And I trust you." Ser Jorah did not hide his longing for Westeros, but he bowed his head and placed a weathered hand over his heart. "Where you go, I follow," he said. "Your father's throne may be your birthright, but it is not who you are. I see who you are. The people see it too." Grey Worm spoke simply. "I am blood of the Unsullied, but I am free. You freed me. We will fight for your new empire." Missandei's voice quivered with gratitude. "I was a slave with no voice. You made me who I am. If you vow to protect others as you did me, there is no throne in the world more important than the one you already hold." And so the matter was decided. Daenerys Targaryen would remain in Essos, but she knew that simply staying would not be enough. She had to secure her fledgling empire, root out all vestiges of slavery, and bring the fractious city-states under a single governance that would not devolve into tyranny. A daunting task, perhaps, but she had 3 dragons and a devoted following, and she felt the power of destiny thrumming in her blood. In the weeks that followed, missives were sent to many of the nearby cities. Astapor, Yunkai, Newguise, Volantis, Karth, and even some of the merchant republics that sprawled across the coasts and rivers of Essos. Her message was clear. She declared her domain the Bay of Dragons and made it known that she would not tolerate slavery, whether it be official or hidden behind 1,000 guises. She invited each city to send representatives to discuss trade alliances and negotiations for peace. Many of the slaver cities were reluctant. After all, they had warred with her before. They did not trust her, and she did not trust them. But they sensed that Daenerys Stormborn, with her dragons and armies, was a power that had to be reckoned with. Some believed they could placate her temporarily, then strike when the moment was right. Tyrion busied himself preparing the throne room for the arrival of envoys, ensuring that everything from the seating arrangements to the refreshments would reflect Meereen's new stance of welcoming, but not weakness. He explained to Daenerys that a ruler in the East did not simply rely on fear or admiration. One must show generosity as well as might, or the fractious cities would never unite under her banner. She agreed, though she could feel her blood heating at the thought of dealing once more with these slavers and cunning merchants. Yet she resolved to control her impulses. Fear alone would not bring them to heel. Neither would mercy alone. Balance was the key. When the envoys arrived, they found Meereen in a state of transformation. Freedmen worked industriously to clean the streets and erect new communal spaces. The pyramids had been partially restored and repurposed for administrative functions. Markets thrummed with activity, and people who had once languished under chains now walked with heads held high. At the gates, the Unsullied stood guard, silent and disciplined as ever, wearing tabards of black and red. The envoys felt their eyes drawn to the sky, where the dragons circled, occasionally releasing echoes of thunderous roars. To witness these beasts in person was to know both awe and terror, and many among the envoys realized that the tales were not exaggerated. Daenerys received them in the grand throne room, perched upon a seat that had been carved from polished black stone. It was not the iron throne of her forefathers, but it was no less imposing in its own right. A dais of smooth, obsidian-like material had been built in the shape of a dragon's claws rising from the floor. She wore a flowing gown of silver and red, her hair braided intricately to evoke her Targaryen heritage, and she spoke in a measured, regal tone. Tyrion stood at her side, offering counsel at every turn. Missandei waited behind the throne, ready to translate or provide any clarification needed. Grey Worm and the Unsullied flanked the chamber, and Ser Jorah lingered near a column, his intense gaze sweeping over everyone who entered. The negotiations began with guarded politeness. Envoys from Yunkai and New Guys brought gifts of gold and rare spices, hoping to flatter the queen. The representatives from Volantis arrived in robes of deep crimson, each wearing a collar of gold or jade to symbolize their city's wealth. The man from Karth was tall and wore a bejeweled mask, speaking in cryptic riddles that made Tyrion roll his eyes. Daenerys maintained her composure, listening to each of them speak about proposed trade pacts, about the mutual benefits of establishing safe passage through the straits, about the potential for forging alliances that would open markets to all. But when the talk circled around to the matter of slavery, an institution that fed the wealth of so many of these cities, she made her stance clear. No forced servitude of any kind would be tolerated under her rule or in any ally's domain. All who acknowledged her sovereignty in the Bay of Dragons must free their slaves immediately and abolish the practice. The hall erupted in quiet murmurs and sideways glances. One envoy tried to bargain, offering a compromise that involved time-delayed manumission. Daenerys's expression hardened. She told them that if they tried to stall or continue the trade of flesh, her dragons would bring fire and blood upon them. Yet she kept her voice steady and even. She was no longer the girl who flared at every challenge. She was a ruler now. She watched them carefully, measuring who among them might be willing to compromise, who was too entrenched in the old ways to bend. Some seemed pliable, those who were pragmatic enough to realize that the world was changing. Others eyed the dragons with undisguised hatred and fear. Once the official talks ended for the day, she dismissed them with a courteous smile. Tyrion escorted the envoys to their quarters within the city, leaving Daenerys alone with Missandei in the throne room. She let out a long, slow breath. "They will not submit easily," she said. "Perhaps they will send assassins next, or stir the sons of the Harpy from the shadows once more." "You are the breaker of chains, your grace," Missandei replied softly. "If you do not stand against them, no one will. They will learn to accept a new order, or they will perish." That night, she held council with Tyrion, Jorah, Grey Worm, and a handful of advisors from among the freedmen. She asked them to outline the next steps in building her empire. A new code of law was essential, one that guaranteed freedom and personhood to all, yet still allowed for commerce, governance, and the realities of a large dominion. Tyrion joked that he had spent many years reading the legal precedents of King's Landing, but he also pointed out that those laws were designed for a feudal monarchy, not a patchwork of former city-states. They would need to adapt. In the midst of these discussions, Daario Naharis, who had once been her lover and had remained behind in Meereen at her command, joined them. He had lingered in her service, assisting with the mercenary forces that had pledged allegiance. The tension that once existed between Daario and Jorah had simmered into mutual respect born of necessity. Daario spoke bluntly. "We have more enemies than you can count in a single evening. The distance between these cities is great. We need to show strength and be ready to crush any city that refuses to abolish slavery. Fear is the only coin some men understand. Daenerys nodded. I do not intend to coddle them, she said. If they rise against me, I will do what must be done. But if they are willing to change, truly change, then I will not burn them to the ground. And so plans began for an ever larger campaign across Essos. Not a campaign of total conquest, but a political mission that blended the might of dragons and armies with negotiation and lawmaking. She would send envoys to each city, demanding fealty in exchange for peace and prosperity. She would offer them trade agreements that promised to enrich them, on the condition that they relinquish slavery. Should they comply, they would be protected under the banner of the new Targaryen Empire in Essos, an empire that championed the rights of the common folk. Should they refuse or attempt to continue the practice in secret, they would feel dragon fire. Word spread swiftly across Essos. Many freedmen in distant cities rose up on their own, taking Daenerys' example as inspiration. Slave rebellions erupted in the smaller enclaves dotting the continent. The aristocracy in those places found that fear alone could no longer keep people in chains. Tales circulated of dragons descending upon caravans that trafficked slaves, scorching them to ashes while the freed captives cried tears of joy and terror. In some places, local rulers, mindful of their city's well-being, chose to submit peacefully. In others, war broke out. One of the earliest such conflicts came from New Guise, a city proud of its heritage dating back to the old empire of Guise that had once battled Valyria. The Giscari considered themselves the rightful heirs of an ancient power. They had bowed to Daenerys only grudgingly when she was in Meereen, and they continued to keep slaves in secret. When Daenerys sent her envoys, they were spat upon and sent back with a warning. No foreign queen shall dictate our sacred traditions. Daenerys responded by gathering her forces, unsullied, sellswords loyal to Dario, and freedmen militias. Tyrion advised caution, but she would not allow them to openly defy the edict on slavery. The campaign against New Guise tested Daenerys' resolve. Her forces surrounded the city, cutting off supplies. She offered them a final chance. Open the gates, free all slaves, and accept her governance. The rulers of New Guise refused. When the gates opened, it was to unleash trained war beasts and chariots that charged at her lines. The Unsullied met them with precise discipline, forming shield walls and counterattacking in disciplined ranks. Dario's mercenaries harried the flanks. High above, Drogon roared, circles of fire trailing from his jaws. The old citadel walls of New Guise proved formidable, built from ancient stone. Yet it was not stone alone that decided battles in this new age. Daenerys took to the sky astride Drogon, the wind lashing at her silver braids, her heart pounding like a war drum. In the distance, Rhaegal and Viserion strafed the ramparts, exhaling plumes of fire that sent stone cracking and defenders shrieking. Grey Worm led the charge across a collapsed section of wall. In the chaos, Daenerys tried to focus her wrath upon the armed defenders, sparing civilians as best she could. But war was never neat. Flames engulfed parts of the city, and the dreadful screams of the dying rose like an infernal choir. She clenched her teeth against the guilt and the rage. She had to see this through. Within 2 days, the city had fallen. It was a victory, but it tasted bitter. The victorious armies found hundreds of enslaved individuals in cramped quarters, many of them starved or beaten. Daenerys freed them at once, and the freedmen's militias poured into the city to begin the process of rebuilding and reordering. She allowed the Giscari nobility to live if they swore loyalty and ended the practice of slavery, publicly and permanently. Some accepted, though she knew their oaths might be false. Others refused, and she had them imprisoned or executed. Tyrion oversaw the establishment of a local council of freedmen, carefully balancing the need for retribution with the necessity of stable governance. Daenerys herself toured the city, looking upon the charred ruins and the wounded populaces. Even in victory, she felt the toll, but she could not falter. In the aftermath, the message rang louder than any previous declaration. The Queen of the Bay of Dragons would not tolerate slavery, and she would bring her dragons to bear if any city defied her edict. Some cities capitulated without raising arms. Others watched from afar, calculating if they could muster enough allies to stand against her. In the meantime, Meereen swelled with refugees, newly freed men, women, and children who sought the protection of the queen. Daenerys welcomed them, but the city's resources were stretched thin. Tents sprang up along the outskirts, forming sprawling camps. Tyrion worked feverishly to arrange better logistics. Roads to bring grain from outlying villages, aqueducts to ensure clean water, and new trade deals with Qarth and Laser to import foodstuffs. The Qarthine envoy in particular was sly, seeking to use the queen's urgent need for supplies as leverage to secure advantageous trade rights. Tyrion negotiated skillfully, reminding them that her dragons could as easily fly to Qarth and send its famed walls up in flames. But Daenerys also recognized that the time for ceaseless war was not sustainable. She needed to show the other cities that they could prosper under her, not just cower. So she offered Qarth a generous trade arrangement, tax reductions and shipping privileges, on the binding condition that Qarth publicly banned slave trading. Qarth complied, at least in writing. When rumors reached her ears that Qarthine merchants continued to fund slave expeditions far inland, she sent Regal on a dramatic show of force. The dragons soared low over the city's walls, roaring and spewing bright green flames into the sky, a reminder that any deception would be met with swift retribution. The city's 13, that storied circle of Qarthine power brokers, scrambled to rein in the illicit slave trade, if only to avoid the queen's wrath. Little by little, a patchwork of alliances formed. Volantis, the mightiest of the free cities, watched this growing power in the east with both fascination and trepidation. Volantis had its own complex system of slavery, with many of the city's elites owning countless slaves. Envoys from Volantis arrived in Meereen to see if they could forge an accord without relinquishing their entire way of life. This was the greatest test of Daenerys' resolve since the conquest of Meereen. Volantis was enormous, wealthy, and ancient. Its population dwarfed that of Meereen, and its fleet was formidable. If it refused her demands, a direct war might be too costly to contemplate, at least in the near term. Tyrion warned her. If we try to take Volantis by force, we may lose everything. Even your dragons cannot be everywhere at once. And the moment we seem vulnerable, your enemies will pounce. We need Volantis to come willingly, or at least be divided from within. So Daenerys took a calculated approach. She sent envoys into the city to appeal to the lower classes and slaves, fomenting dissatisfaction with the old ways, planting seeds of rebellion. In the meantime, she invited the Triarchs of Volantis for talks in Meereen, treating them with all the pomp and deference expected for foreign heads of state. She offered them an alliance that would see Volantis remain largely autonomous, free to govern itself, as long as it abolished slavery and recognized Daenerys as the supreme protector of Essos, a mostly ceremonial title, but one that symbolized her moral authority. The Triarchs balked. They saw the writing on the wall, though the freedmen across Essos, galvanized by the queen's example, had become a powder keg. If the Triarchs refused, Daenerys' envoys would ensure that rebellion swept through Volantis' lower rings. If the Triarchs accepted, they would anger many wealthy nobles. They stalled for time, requesting further negotiations, gifts, tributes. Daenerys tolerated their stalling only to a point. A subtle dance began between the palace in Meereen and the council halls of Volantis. Every so often, Daenerys would make a show of strength, sending a flight of dragons within sight of the Volantene coastline, or mobilizing her armies to undertake training exercises near the border. The Triarchs, in turn, teased the possibility of partial reforms, or the adoption of indentured servitude in place of slavery. Daenerys refused to yield. "No chains in my domain," she repeated whenever they pressed her. Tensions mounted. In the end, the Triarchs realized that an outright confrontation could provoke an internal uprising they might not be able to contain. The freedmen in Volantis, emboldened by Daenerys' example, already conspired to overthrow their masters if an open conflict began. Reluctantly, the Triarchs conceded, signing an accord that mandated the gradual freeing of all slaves within Volantis's borders over a specified timeframe, with a system of restitution to appease the slave owners. It was not the clean break Daenerys had initially hoped for, but Tyrion urged her to accept the compromise, at least as a first step. "Allow them to believe they have saved face," he advised. "As long as the slaves are freed in practice, the old power structures will crumble soon enough." Daenerys agreed, but she made certain the timeline was short, less than a year, and that representatives of her new empire, along with local freedmen councils, would oversee compliance. The Triarchs scowled at the intrusive oversight, but they signed. Many in Volantis whispered that it was better to do so than face the flames of the dragons. And so, one by one, city-states across Essos were compelled to end the slave trade, some by choice, others by threat of force, and still others by actual conquest. With each step, Daenerys' empire spread, not as a tidy, centralized kingdom, but as a patchwork of alliances, protectorates, and conquered territories, all bound by one unbreakable law: no man, woman, or child in this domain should wear chains. As the months rolled on, Daenerys took steps to formalize the new system of governance. She had no wish to hold court in Meereen alone. She traveled widely, occasionally by sea with her fleet, but more often on Drogon's back, visiting the major cities that had pledged allegiance or had been forced to capitulate. In each, she would oversee the appointment of councils, made up of both former slaves and those masters who had accepted the new order. She listened to petitions, dispensed justice, and made shows of her power by flying the dragons overhead. She wanted to ensure that her presence was felt everywhere, that the freedmen knew she was real and not just a rumor, and that the local elites understood she was not to be trifled with. It was during these travels that she began to sense a shift in her own self-perception. She was no longer a beggar princess seeking a throne that existed mostly in myth. She was a ruler in her own right, a queen of Essos, forging something that had never been seen before. A continental domain built on the principle that the lowliest had as much right to freedom as the highest. She began to call herself Daenerys of House Targaryen, Queen of the Bay of Dragons, Empress of Essos, Breaker of Chains, Mother of Dragons. Perhaps the titles grew cumbersome, but each was a reflection of who she had become. In the midst of this monumental shift, the question of the Dothraki arose. After all, she had emerged from the flames of Vis Dothrak as the unburnt Khalasar uniters. Countless Dothraki warriors had pledged themselves to her. At first, she had used them to help secure Meereen and its environs, but the Dothraki were not a people who took easily to city life. They roamed the seas of grass, and it was in that vast steppe that they felt most alive. Yet they acknowledged her as their queen, the one who had walked through fire. Now, with her new empire stretching outward, she recognized that the Dothraki represented both a tremendous asset and a challenge. They could be the spearhead of her army's fearsome riders who, in large numbers, could overwhelm almost any conventional force. But they also harbored their own traditions, including a deep-seated acceptance of pillage and the taking of slaves. She had to lead them away from such barbaric practices if they were to remain under her banner. Her approach was twofold. She summoned the Dothraki Khals and their blood riders to meet her at Vis Dothrak, the sacred city of the Horse Lords. She flew in on Drogon, accompanied by Rhaegal and Viserion, making an unmistakable statement about her power. The Khals, once proud and dismissive of any form of rulership beyond their own traditions, knelt before her. She spoke to them in their language, reminding them that she had defied the old ways by walking through fire unburnt, that she had defeated Khal Moro and all who refused to bend. She declared that a new age had dawned, one in which the Dothraki would no longer take slaves or raid peaceful settlements under her rule. Instead, they would ride as her honorable warriors, protectors of the new empire that stretched beyond the horizon. In return, they would be free to roam and maintain their customs, as long as those customs did not violate her central edict of freedom. Many of the Khals bristled at the notion, but her hold over them was absolute. She had proven her might and her divine aura in their eyes. Still, Daenerys did not rely solely on fear. She offered them wealth that far exceeded the spoils of raiding. The trade routes she had opened allowed for the flow of fine goods, silks, spices, precious gems, steel weapons, and the Dothraki could be paid to guard those routes against bandits or rival hordes. They could earn glory in defending caravans, not just in sacking them. Further, she reminded them of the wonder of dragons. The Dothraki, awed by Drogon and his kin, saw in them a symbol of unstoppable might. Serving a rider of dragons elevated them in their own eyes, as if they were part of a living legend. So, grudgingly at first, but with growing enthusiasm, they accepted. The presence of the Dothraki in the new empire became a fearsome deterrent against any would-be rebellion. As Daenerys' empire expanded, the freedmen found hope in her promise. Yet no empire rises without struggle. Skirmishes flared on many fronts. Some city-states half-heartedly accepted her rule only to try reasserting the slave trade in secret. She responded swiftly when discovered, punishing the ringleaders publicly. Spies carried news of her crackdown from city to city, ensuring that the lesson was learned. Her laws were not empty words. Still, a large continent cannot be tamed overnight. Tyrion stressed the importance of building sustainable institutions. A standing army, a fair judicial system, and a council of advisors drawn from every major region. Daenerys agreed. She announced the formation of an imperial council, headquartered in Meereen but convening in different cities on a rotating basis. Each city under her domain would send representatives, both freedmen and freeborn, to debate matters of policy. This was an unprecedented experiment. Essos had never been united under one system of governance like this. It had long been a tapestry of city-states, tribes, and petty kingdoms. Now, they were loosely tied under Daenerys' empire, but cultural differences abounded. During council meetings, arguments erupted regularly. In one such gathering in Yunkai, freedmen's representatives demanded reparations from the former masters who had profited for generations on the backs of slaves. Tyrion mediated, pointing out that if every freedman demanded compensation in gold, the city's economy might collapse. But Grey Worm sided fervently with the freedmen, reminding all that the masters had benefited from centuries of oppression. Daenerys, seated at the head of the assembly, listened to the heated debate until she signaled silence with a raised hand. She proposed a compromise, a system of labor grants and land distribution that would allow freedmen to establish their own farms or crafts, subsidized by taxes levied on the former masters. It was not perfect, and some freedmen felt it too lenient, while some masters thought it ruinous. But it passed. Such was the nature of her rule. Not an iron-fisted tyranny, nor a chaotic democracy, but something that tried to blend the queen's moral authority with the voices of her subjects. Her dragons grew as the years went by, each the size of a modest ship. Drogon, the largest, was fierce and often temperamental. He would soar for hours above the grasslands, hunting great beasts and sometimes disappearing for days on end. Yet when Daenerys called, he answered. The bond between them was unbreakable. She sometimes worried that Viserion and Rhaegal did not receive the same attention she lavished on Drogon, but the two were content to roam together, occasionally resting on the high cliffs around Meereen or the volcanic slopes near the Valyrian Peninsula. News traveled that the old Valyrian ruins sometimes shimmered with distant flame, as if the dragons had begun to roost amid the haunted remains of Daenerys' ancestral homeland. Tyrion mused on the significance. Perhaps they sensed the blood in the stone, or perhaps the ghosts of Valyria welcomed them home. Between her visits to the newly formed Imperial Council and her expeditions to quell rebellion, Daenerys had little time for rest. She led from the front, forging new roads, ensuring that her armies remained disciplined, overseeing the distribution of resources to freedmen communities. She made alliances with local nomads, such as the Lazarene, who still remembered both the horrors inflicted upon them by the Dothraki and the mercy shown by Daenerys in the past. Under her new empire, they found protection against future raiders. In return, they provided grain, cloth, and knowledge of their farmland. She reached out even to remote enclaves along the Shivering Sea, though the distances were great and some city-states there had little interest in forging ties. Still, her message spread. One day, she stood on the newly built walls of New Guise, now a loyal city in her empire, gazing out over the horizon where the ocean met the sky. Yora stood beside her. "It has been years since we first came to Slaver's Bay," he remarked. "We've made it our home, haven't we, Your Grace?" She nodded, her eyes distant. "My life used to be about a single goal, reclaiming the throne my father lost. Now I've found another purpose. Perhaps it was always meant to be." Yora smiled gently, though sadness lingered in his gaze. "You could still go west, you know. There may come a time when Westeros calls, if their wars have not torn them apart." Daenerys considered his words. She had heard rumors from across the sea, rumors of wars among the great houses, of an undead threat in the north, of winter's wrath. A pang of guilt lanced her heart, recalling that she had family ties to that land, but she had chosen her path. "If Westeros needs me," she said quietly, "they will have to prove it. I cannot abandon this. Not now." He inclined his head. "As you say, Your Grace." Meanwhile, Tyrion remained busy with the intricacies of administration. He had formed a cadre of scribes and officials, many of them literate freedmen, who traveled to different cities, recording census data, collecting taxes, and ensuring that local rulers abided by the empire's laws. The taxes, in turn, funded the unsullied armies, the freedmen militias, and major public works. Roads, aqueducts, ports, and the beginnings of a continental postal network to allow messages to travel quickly by horse or pigeon. Progress was slow, but unstoppable. Every measure that strengthened the ties between cities also strengthened Daenerys' position as empress. In the city once known as Astapor, now reclaimed and rebuilt, a freedmen's council took charge. The giant harpy statue that once symbolized the city's old power had been torn down, replaced by a broad public square where people could gather. Daenerys visited them to confirm their place within the empire. She sat in a modest seat at the front of an open forum, letting freedmen speak about issues that plagued them: food shortages, lingering bandit attacks, sickness. She promised them relief efforts, roving patrols from the Unsullied, and trade caravans of grain. In return, she expected them to keep order and abide by the new laws. Their cheers rang out across the square. She saw in their eyes a devotion stronger than any vow of fealty. They loved her because she had changed their world. Not everyone loved her, of course. Former masters whispered in dark corners that she was a tyrant. Ambitious merchants wondered if they could profit by undermining her. Rival warlords far to the east, beyond the Dothraki Sea, grumbled that her empire was strangling their raiding routes. But none dared mount a united challenge, for each faction feared her dragons and her loyal armies. A precarious peace settled across the center of Essos, punctuated by occasional flare-ups that Daenerys or her generals swiftly crushed. An unforeseen consequence of her expansion was the cultural exchange that blossomed in the new empire. Freedmen who traveled from one city to another carried their traditions, their music, their languages. The imperial council sessions themselves became a melting pot of ideas. Scholars from distant lands arrived in Meereen to study the dragons, to see how a new multi-ethnic empire could function. Temples to various gods sprang up, from the Lord of Light to the Great Shepherd of Lazer. Daenerys observed this with guarded optimism. She encouraged freedom of religion, so long as it did not clash with her core decree: no slavery. Clerics of R'hllor, priests of the Giscari gods, and others gathered in the city's temples, sometimes clashing in theological debates but more often finding that they had to coexist under the watchful eye of the queen. One dawn, as she prepared to fly to a border region plagued by bandits, Tyrion approached her with a letter from the west. It bore the seal of a raven, a sign that it had come from Westeros. Apparently, the letter had journeyed through Pentos and then to Volantis, eventually reaching Meereen. It carried tidings from the Seven Kingdoms. The War of the Five Kings had ended, but chaos still reigned. The White Walkers had descended from the far north, and rumor said that House Stark, led by Jon Snow, had rallied men and women to face the undead threat. The letter included a plea for aid, scrawled in desperate terms. Tyrion studied Daenerys' reaction. She read it silently, her expression unreadable. There had been a time when such a letter would have roused her ambition immediately, sending her fleet toward King's Landing to claim her birthright and then unify the kingdoms to stand against the darkness. But now, After all these years of building something new in Essos, her priorities had changed. She handed the letter back to Tyrion. "They implore me to cross the sea and save them," she said. "But where were they when I begged for help in securing my home here? Where were they when I pleaded for ships, for recognition, for so much as a token of solidarity? They did not want me a Targaryen queen. Now they face a terror I never imagined, and they call on me because of my dragons." Tyrion kept his tone neutral. "What will you do?" Daenerys closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, then exhaled. "Essos is my home. These people here are my responsibility. If I abandon them now, everything I've built would falter. The freedmen rely on me. My presence keeps slavers from rising again. I cannot depart just because Westeros has realized it needs dragons." He nodded in understanding. "Yet, there may be another path. We could send an envoy, a token force, perhaps. A few riders on dragons, a handful of soldiers, enough to help but not leave our empire defenseless. It might show that you do not hold a grudge, and it could forge a future alliance if the White Walkers are truly as terrible as the stories claim." She considered the idea. It appealed to her sense of justice and compassion, for she did not wish for the innocent in Westeros to suffer. But she had no desire to become mired in their politics. "Very well," she said at length. "Select volunteers from among my loyal knights and freedmen, perhaps a few Dothraki who might want to see new lands. Let them sail with one dragon, Viserion or Regal, and see what they find. If they can help, so be it. But I will not leave Essos." Tyrion bowed. "I'll make the arrangements." And so, a small expedition set out, led by Ser Jorah and a few of the Queen's most trusted warriors. Viserion flew overhead, with one of the Queen's Dothraki bloodriders daring to guide him. Daenerys watched from the docks as the ships vanished over the horizon, on her heart heavier than she cared to admit. Jorah's last words to her had been a pledge to return if he survived. She had placed faith in him, one final time, but did not know what fate awaited him in Westeros. Life in the new empire continued. Daenerys devoted herself to ensuring stability. Astapor, Yunkai, Meereen, Newguise, Volantis. These were the major centers under her direct oversight, each with freedmen councils, local militias, and strong ties to the capital. Karth remained a trade partner, if not a fully integrated city. Other regions recognized her suzerainty to varying degrees, with local governance that agreed to her anti-slavery edict. The Dothraki roamed, occasionally putting down pockets of raiders or bandits at her command. The dragons patrolled the skies, though Drogon was most often at her side, content to remain near his mother. Tyrion's next major initiative was to establish a capital that symbolized the unity of Essos. Meereen served as the seat of Daenerys' power, but the city still carried the legacy of old resentments. So the council proposed constructing a new city on the eastern bank of the river that flowed into the Bay of Dragons, a place that could be shaped from the ground up, free of the baggage of the past. Daenerys was intrigued, but also wary of pouring resources into building a grand capital when so many freedmen still needed sustenance. Tyrion argued that a strong symbol could galvanize the entire empire, showing that they were building a new future together. After many debates, Daenerys approved a modest start, with the idea that it would grow organically over time. Plans were drawn to lay wide avenues, a central forum, a great hall for the Imperial Council, and a grand roost for the dragons, though the last idea was more symbolic than practical, given how dragons roamed at will. The process of building this new city was slow and fraught with challenges. Labor had to be paid for fairly, which meant raising funds. Tyrion oversaw negotiations with the wealthiest merchants and bankers across Essos, promising them a stake in the future seat of the empire if they financed its construction. Many saw profit in the venture, hoping to corner trade and influence. Freedmen who were skilled masons, carpenters, and artisans found employment, and wages circulated back into local economies. Daenerys insisted on the presence of freedmen in supervisory roles, a stark departure from the old order in which only the wealthy or noble could command such projects. This created friction, but Tyrion was adept at smoothing it over. The promise of progress and potential wealth silenced many critics. While the grand new capital rose, Daenerys spent her days dealing with the countless administrative tasks that empire building demanded. She settled disputes between city councils, mediated conflicts between freedmen's militias, and signed edicts regulating trade and travel. She also made time to address the cultural differences that sometimes led to violence among newly freed populations who held grudges from the days of slavery. Her position as queen required her to be both a warrior and a peacemaker. She traveled constantly, holding open forums wherever she went, listening to grievances. The freedmen adored her for this. The old aristocrats resented her, yet begrudgingly acknowledged her unstoppable momentum. Years passed. The empire grew more interconnected. Some freedmen and local leaders began referring to it as the Targaryen Empire, though Daenerys herself preferred the title of Empress of Essos, wanting it to encompass all the peoples under her rule, not just her own dynasty. The dragons matured, patrolling the skies with regal dominance. Their presence ensured that no army dared march against her in earnest. Perhaps a clever assassin could still threaten her life, but the attempt would spark cataclysmic repercussions. That fear kept many foes at bay, although plots occasionally surfaced, only to be stamped out by her ever-watchful advisors. In time, a new generation was born into this empire, children who had never worn chains, never seen the harpy flags of slaver cities, never known a world in which a Targaryen queen was an outsider. They ran in the streets, learned in the newly built schools, and saw the dragons overhead as a natural part of their world. To these children, Daenerys was less a conqueror and more of a mother figure for an entire continent, the living embodiment of the promise that they need not fear being sold or whipped. It was among these children that she found hope, for they cared little for the grudges of the past. They grew up with freedmen and old aristocrats side by side, forging friendships that would have been impossible a generation ago. In the quiet hours of the night, Daenerys would sometimes wander the halls of the Great Pyramid or the newly constructed imperial buildings, accompanied by the loyal footsteps of Grey Worm and Missandei. She would recall the heartbreaks that had led her here. Losing Khal Drogo, the bitter betrayals, the fight for Myreen's soul. She thought of her ancestors who had once conquered Westeros with dragons, forging a dynasty that lasted centuries. Yet she felt that what she had done here might be greater still, if it could endure. She had not simply conquered, she had transformed, and though it had cost rivers of blood and tears, though she had sometimes acted with ruthless severity, she told herself it was all to build a better world. The freedmen would not argue with that. They saw her as their savior. Sometimes, she pondered the name Breaker of Chains. The act of breaking something was violent, destructive. Now she had to be a builder, a creator of systems that could outlast her. She had no illusions about her own mortality. One day, she would die, whether by the hand of an assassin, the ravages of old age, or the unpredictable nature of the world. What then? Would her empire crumble into rival city-states again? Or would it stand as a monument to what people could achieve when united by a single ideal? She began to craft a succession plan, though it was not an easy matter. She had no child of her own yet, no heir in the traditional sense. Some suggested she name a council of regents to govern after her passing. Others urged her to consider marriage, but the memory of Drogo still kindled a lonely ache within her, and her focus remained on governance, not personal alliance. Still, she recognized that for the empire to survive, it needed clarity on the future. Thus, she designated that upon her death, the Imperial Council would hold the authority to choose the next monarch or caretaker. She had no illusions that it would be a simple or bloodless process. Yet it was a statement that her empire was bigger than her alone. Tyrion labored tirelessly to codify this system in writing, penning charters and edicts that the freedmen councils could endorse. He had learned from his time in King's Landing the importance of clear legal frameworks. Missandei assisted with translations into various tongues. The result was an evolving set of documents collectively referred to as the Dragon's Code, which enshrined the prohibition of slavery, established basic rights for freedmen, and outlined the responsibilities of local governance. While many in Essos were illiterate, the code's existence was a powerful symbol, and freedmen leaders learned its tenets by heart. As the empire matured, Daenerys found pockets of time for quiet reflection, often in the presence of her dragons. On one such occasion, she flew with Drogon to the outskirts of the Dothraki Sea, where she visited a modest settlement that had grown near a major crossing. There, freedmen and Dothraki coexisted, bartering horses for farm goods. Children with braids mingled with children in simple cotton tunics. She landed among them, a swirl of dust kicking up, the thunderous flap of Drogon's wings echoing across the plains. At first, the people stood in awe, dropping to their knees. Some called her Mysa, some called her Khaleesi, others called her Empress. She stepped down, her boots hitting the earth, and for a moment she could not contain her amazement at what she saw. It was not the forced hush of fear she had witnessed in conquered cities, nor the frenzied adoration of freedmen seeing her as a savior. It was something more natural, more ordinary. They simply welcomed her as the one who had made this life possible. She walked among them, speaking to a Dothraki woman who had started a small orchard with date palms, irrigated by a nearby stream. This woman, once a warrior who had lost her husband in a Khalasar battle, had decided to settle and farm instead of following the call. Her young son guided a plow drawn by a pair of horses, and she explained to Daenerys that she could earn a living now, free, unburdened. Daenerys asked if she missed the old ways. The woman only shrugged. "I can ride if I want, but I can also grow and sell dates. My son can learn to read if he chooses. This is what it means to be free, yes." Daenerys smiled, feeling the heat of tears in her eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "This is what it means to be free." A hush fell over her memory of endless battles and strife. This was why she had chosen to stay in Essos. This was the future she wanted to create, one where freedom was not just a word but a tangible reality for the common folk. She spent some hours there, sharing a meal of dates and flatbread, listening to stories. Drogon remained perched on a rocky outcrop, watchful but calm. The people seemed at ease with the presence of a dragon. They were learning to accept that such wonders could become commonplace in a realm shaped by Daenerys Targaryen. When she returned to Meereen, she found Tyrion waiting with fresh dispatches. "Our intelligence suggests that some slavers from Sarnath are banding together, attempting to funnel people north to a hidden market," he explained. "Likely they hope to avoid our patrols. If they succeed, it could undermine everything we've done. We need to make an example of them." Daenerys felt the old fire rise in her veins. She nodded. "Have Grey Worm assemble a strike force. I'll lead them personally." And once more, she set out to enforce her edicts, this time targeting hidden slave markets that had sprung up like weeds. In her mind, the image of that Dothraki orchard lingered, reminding her of the stakes. She would not allow any new chain to be forged. She rode out with the Unsullied, the freedmen militias, and the Dothraki outriders, crushing the illegal slavers and freeing their captives. Each victory came at a cost. Blood spilled on both sides, but she refused to relent. She offered those who surrendered a chance at redemption if they swore never again to deal in flesh. Many scoffed, believing she could not possibly police the entire continent. She demonstrated otherwise by methodically dismantling their networks, stationing outposts at key crossroads and paying informants to alert her to any whisper of renewed trade. And so her empire endured, a tapestry of once hostile city-states bound together by an empress who would brook no return to the old ways. Over time, the freedmen gained footholds in local governance, rewriting the social order of Essos. The old aristocrats who clung to their traditions either adapted or faded into irrelevance. The roads became safer, and trade flourished as caravans knew they could travel without fear of slaver raids. Merchants from Westeros even ventured east, bringing news of events across the Narrow Sea, how the White Walkers had been fought and, according to rumor, destroyed at great cost. But these events felt distant to Daenerys and her people. The new Targaryen Empire had concerns of its own. Daenerys found moments of joy in seeing the freedmen's children laugh and run along the plazas of the great cities, in hearing them sing ballads about the mother of dragons. She felt sorrow for those lost along the way, her own unborn child Rhaego, Khal Drogo, Ser Barristan Selmy, and all the countless who had died to bring about this new order. She also remained mindful that her empire, like any mortal creation, was fragile. It required constant vigilance to maintain. She had no illusions that peace was eternal or guaranteed. Yet she believed fiercely that her cause was just, and she knew she had changed the world, if only in this corner of it. On a warm evening under the glow of torchlight, Daenerys walked through the courtyard of the palace in Meereen, her dragons slumbering on high perches. She thought of her ancestors who had left Valyria to conquer Westeros. They had forged an empire with dragonfire and steel. She, too, had used dragons and armies to shape her realm, but her dream had not been feudal dominance. It was the dream of breaking the chains that bound the common folk. Perhaps in another timeline, she might have sailed west to claim the Iron Throne, bringing war to the Seven Kingdoms and drenching that land in blood. Here, in Essos, she had done so as well, but for a cause that sought to lift up the downtrodden rather than simply enthrone herself in a legacy seat of power. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the night air. She could smell spices from a nearby vendor cart, the sweat of laborers finishing a late shift in a construction yard, the salt wind drifting in from the bay. She heard the laughter of freedmen returning home, the hushed murmur of a city that no longer cowered in fear. And beneath it all, she felt the slow, steady pulse of an empire that lived and breathed on its own. An empire she had nurtured and defended at every turn. For all its flaws and uncertainties, for all the battles still to be fought, this was her home, her destiny. She was Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, the Empress of Essos, the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons. And by giving up one throne, she had built another, a throne fashioned not from swords, but from the hopes and freedoms of millions. And on nights like this, under the stars that glowed brighter than any crown, she felt a peace in her heart that no Iron Throne could ever have given her.